Attention horror fans, Colleen, A Vlada Tale of the Damned is the forthcoming comic book sequel to Vlada, A Dracula Tale, a gender-swapped spin on the world of Dracula, featuring an original story by Chris Denmead and art by Matt Slay and Tim Vigil. The Kickstarter campaign for this 28-page comic book is now live. Visit Colleen, A Vlada Tale of the Damned on Kickstarter and back this project now. Check out the Vlada, A Dracula Tale Facebook page for more. My love of the TV series Smallville is well documented, and there's one rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring great insight, passion, and humor to each and every episode. And the podcast continues with more great Smallville and Superman talk now that their series rewatch has concluded. Listen wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On To banner, including Arrow, Star Wars, and more. As a Superman fan, have you ever wondered what would happen if a person who knew barely anything about comics decided to absorb hundreds of Superman stories from all eras and media? Robbo is that kind of person, and that's exactly what he's done on a new show called This Podcast Will Never Die. The first season, called Superman Will Never Die, starts with the unexpected ways the Man of Steel stood out from the pulp heroes on the newsstands in 1938. Listen and subscribe to This Podcast Will Never Die, and you'll never look at Superman's trunks the same way again. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the post-Infinite Crisis Action Comics run by writer Geoff Johns is the host of the Superhero Cinephiles podcast, returning guest Perry Constantine. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me. Always glad to come on, and it was a lot of fun going back and revisiting these books.
I'm excited to compare notes. Look, over the years, we have hit on virtually all of the major Superman stories by Geoff Johns, but we've never put them all together and gotten into it in this comprehensive and concentrated a way as we are going to do now. And I didn't want to cram everything into one episode, so we decided to split this, make it a two-part event. So in this episode, in part one, you and I are going to discuss the following storylines: the 1 year later arc Up, Up, and Away, which was a crossover between Action Comics and Superman, co-written with Kurt Busiek, art by Pete Woods. And then the two arcs that Geoff Johns co-wrote with director Richard Donner, Last Son, with art by Adam Kubert, and Escape from Bizarro World, with art by Eric Powell. Let me start with, I guess, the big picture question. Beyond just his Superman work, what has your relationship been with the works of Geoff Johns generally over the years?
So I first became acquainted with Johns when he did Avengers, actually, which also following Kurt Busiek's run. And that was my first introduction to him, and I really dug that. I thought he did a great follow-up to the Avengers. The World Trust arc set up a really cool new status quo for them. Red Zone is one of the best Red Skull stories I've ever read, had an amazing Black Panther and Captain America moments in that story. And I wasn't really a big DC guy back at the time, so I was kind of late to the boat getting to him. And it was, I think, maybe Infinite Crisis was the first of his DC stuff I read. And then slowly over time, I started to read some other stuff like Teen Titans, Green Lantern, Rebirth, Flashpoint, and so on and so forth. And I don't. Generally, I like his stuff. I think I'd say I'm a fan, but I'm not like a super fan. He's one of these writers who people seem to have a very passionate opinion about, like they really love him or they really hate him. And I've never really fallen into either camp of that. I've always just been kind of like solidly in the middle. Like I'm like, yeah, I enjoy some of his stuff. Some of his other stuff, I have questions about. But for the most part, I think he's generally a pretty good writer, is what I would probably say.
It's funny because Geoff Johns has come up a good number of times on this podcast over the years. And I feel like if you were to go back and tally up all of the mentions of him, I feel like more often than not, his name has come up in a more critical context where I've been citing something that maybe I took issue with. But for the record, I am a fan of Geoff Johns. And when we go back to that 2000 to 2006 stretch from the beginnings of his time there, I was a little bit late to the party. I mostly missed Stars and Stripe, but I was there for the beginning of his Flash run and the beginning of his work on JSA. He came on board that book with issue number 6. He replaced co-writer James Robinson and then would co-write the book with David Goyer moving forward. But I was there from the start of all of that. And I've talked about this many times over the years, but that stretch of years that I mentioned, that really represents kind of my golden age as a comic book fan and reader, because that's the point in time where I was expanding my horizons beyond just the Superman titles. I was working on my local comic shop. I was surrounded by all this stuff. I was just having conversations with people that I wasn't having before. And his work played a large role in that. And, you know, I look at Flash and JSA and Hawkman and Teen Titans and Green Lantern, and man, I was there for all of that. And he was the guy. I mean, if for anyone who wasn't reading DC Comics at the time, he was everywhere and really had the golden touch. And I'm not really breaking any new ground to say that I think what his strength is as a writer is really being able to crystallize kind of those core elements about a character and then build out from there and tell fresh, engaging stories that also honor the history and the legacy of the characters for the most part. And I think you really see something like that on full display when you look at his runs on JSA and Titans, where we're honoring those legacy characters and the histories of those teams, but we're also bringing in the next generation and really moving them forward. And I mean, his work on JSA and Titans and Hawkman and Hal Jordan really introduced me to those characters in a major way. So he looms large, kind of when we talk about my larger reading history and fan journey and all of that. So credit where credit's due. I have been and do remain a Geoff Johns fan. Ironically and tragically, I feel like the place where I've butted up against his work the most has been on the Superman side.
No, that's fair. And you know, it's funny when you're talking about that, about your golden age. And I think our golden ages are both roughly about the same time of our lives, although we're a few years apart in age. So my golden age was like about a few years before yours. So for me, it was like the late 90s, right until about like 2003, 2004-ish. And then that's when I kind of fell off of stuff when I became a broke college student. I couldn't afford comics. And so I stopped. I took a break from comics around the time when Geoff Johns' star was really like on the rise. So if I had been like in the same boat as you, because I was getting into DC stuff, but it was through stuff like Joe Kelly and Jeff Loeb and Peter David. And it wasn't until Johns came after those guys. So then I came on after that. And so if I'd come on at that same point, I think I probably would have had a different opinion of Johns than I do now, which is mostly retrospect in a lot of ways, because I'm looking back on a lot of his stuff now and I'm reading it after the paint is dry and passions have cooled on it. So when people were all, you know, differing opinions on whether or not Hal Jordan should come back or not and all that kind of stuff, whether or not Barry Allen should come back. And me, I'm looking at it as, you know, years later, I'm going back and I'm looking at it, I'm like, it's a good story. Or I'm not sure if this was so necessary or not. But so, and same thing with like, and this Superman stuff, I get that too. I felt that a lot, especially when I had a very different reaction this time when I was reading like Last Sun compared to when the first time I read it. And then when I read like Up and Away, and first time I read Up and Away, I loved it. And I loved it again this time when I read it. And Last Sun, I had a very different reaction this time as opposed to the first time I read it. So it is funny to go back and see like how my opinion has changed over time with some of these books.
Dude, 100%. I feel like this run for me is a perfect representation of exactly what you described, because this run, especially beginning with that Last Sun arc moving forward, because I always enjoyed Up and Away, but especially from Last Sun forward, the experience I had reading it in real time, very different than reading it now in a vacuum, sort of unto itself. I was still at my local comic shop, and I remember when that first part of Last Sun came out, Action 844, and I remember flipping through it in the store, and we'll get into it more specifically, but in those opening pages, Superman goes to his newly formed Ice Palace fortress, and he inserts the Sunstone crystal into the console, and we see the holographic head of Jor-El, who welcomes him home. And Superman says, "I have lived among them for many years." And right there on page 2 or 3, I said to myself, oop, that's not Superman. That's not my Superman. And that issue progresses, and Superman's flying through Metropolis, and he's telling kids, make sure you drink your orange juice. And Clark is getting chewed out by Perry White, and Jimmy Olsen is making coffee runs and can't take a photo to save his life. And I'm just like, oh, this is just not the version of these characters that I have been reading throughout most of the post-crisis era. And I had a really hard time accessing this Geoff Johns run because of that for a while. Thankfully, my perspective has shifted a ton. And like I said, now I can kind of look at this for what it is and enjoy it a lot more. But that at its heart was like the big problem that I had at the time, was that injection of those Superman 78 Richard Donner sensibilities into the comics, into what was still ostensibly the post-crisis version of the character, even though we were coming out of Infinite Crisis and there had been some continuity changes. It wasn't a full-on reboot. I really had a hard time with that at the time.
No, I totally get that. And because the first time I read Last Sun was completely in isolation. So the first time I read it, I'm like, oh, this is a pretty cool story. I'm really kind of digging this. And then when I read it now, this time, I'm still not completely, clued into all the continuity of what was happening at that time, but I'm more clued into it than I was before. In large part thanks to your show as well, because you helped fill in a lot of those gaps for me. And when I was reading it, I clued in on exactly those things, like his, the Jor-El AI thing, the whole Perry's entire characterization. I got some things to say about that. The fact that Jimmy has gone from up and away to calling him Clark to all of a sudden he's calling him Mr. Kent all the time, and that continues on throughout all the rest of the run. That really felt jarring to me. And even Clark's behavior, because I mean, I'm on record saying like I don't like the John Byrne man of action Clark Kent. I feel like he's too arrogant. But I do like I think the Superman the Animated Series version where he's kind of like he's got this quiet confidence where he's not bumbling or anything, but he's also still kind of buttoned down a little bit, and he's still like kind of keeping he's keeping his head down type of thing, but he chops in when he's necessary. Like him kind of like, bumbling around when he's talking to Perry and all that kind of stuff. That it felt off to me a lot more this time than it did last time.
Yeah, and that's why now, just reading it in a vacuum, I'm definitely able to appreciate it more and evaluate and ultimately enjoy the stories on their own merits without getting so hung up on the extent to which they lined up with the continuity I was expecting them to. So there's something to be said for that. I think we've already at least partially answered this, but I'm still going to pose the question because we're laying this all out and tackling some big picture ideas about this run, and I want to spend the time on this. I mentioned those other key core Geoff Johns runs that preceded this one that I was a fan of. I was a fan of all of them. And I think we mentioned with JSA and Teen Titans, honoring the legacy while incorporating the new generations. I think those were driving themes. With Hawkman, this whole idea of reincarnation and reconciling all of the discrepancies in Hawkman's continuity was a huge part of that. Flash, man, did he do so much great work with the Rogues and really delved into their psychology and their motivations and really made me a fan of that whole world in a way that I had enjoyed Flash before, but this really took it to another level. On the Green Lantern side, I mean, aside from restoring Hal Jordan to glory, I would say the other predominant aspect of that run was the expansion of the mythology with respect to the emotional spectrum and all these other cores. And look, I've alluded to this before. I like the idea of that, and I like the beginnings of that as they played out. After a while, I really kind of felt like, okay, this is enough. But it was very popular and really did a lot for that whole Green Lantern corner of the DC universe. I bring all this up to say that I think we look at those other runs and we can kind of point to those specific things that really stand out as distinguishing characteristics of those runs. And so my question to you is, on the Superman side, what do you feel are the equivalents? Like, what stands out when you look at his work on Action Comics during this post-Infinite Crisis period? What would you say, if anything, right, is the equivalent of that here?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is you could definitely see that he's got a real hard on for Superman 78. I think that cannot be denied at all. But also you can see a real love of the Silver Age stuff. Like he really, bringing in the Legion and stuff, bringing back Bizarro World. So you can see a lot of those pre-crisis elements really kind of bringing it. And I feel like with Up and Away, I felt like there was a much We also Escape from a Bizarro World too, because he did a pretty good. I gotta tip my hat to him. I thought he did a pretty good job trying to explain how Bizarro World is formed and everything. Um, I think when and here's the thing about Jeff Johns, I think is maybe kind of key. Is like when he's forced to try, he can come up with really good explanations to try and work these things in, like he did with also the Toyman issue, which we'll be talking about next episode. That was another great example of that too. But other times, I feel like there's this point where now he's gotten to this point where he's such a big name that he can kind of get away with whatever he wants, and it's very similar to, last time I was on your show we talked a bunch about Bendis, and I feel like Bendis is kind of in the same boat where early on when they were forced to try and they were forced to kind of work hard, they were doing it. But when they got so big that they couldn't be questioned, then editors just kind of let them run free a little bit and they started getting a little bit lazy. And I think that's kind of happened with some of the Superman stuff, because some of the stuff that happens with, the Perry White and the Jimmy Olsen type thing, those types of character dynamics, it's just like, well, we want the Superman 78 dynamic, so we're just going to do it.
Yes. And I've really been reflecting a lot after rereading everything together over these past couple of days. Finished my homework only hours ago, but as is usually the case. But, I was really thinking a lot about, okay, how do I kind of sum all of this up, this Jeff Johns run? And I already laid out the arcs we're going to talk about this time more specifically. For next time, you mentioned the Toyman issue, yes, which is, I think, Jeff Johns at his Jeff Johnsiest we'll talk about. But we'll also talk about all of Johns' collaborations with artist Gary Frank. So the arcs Superman and the Legion of Superheroes, Brainiac, and then that Secret Origin miniseries as well. So that's what's coming up next week. But I think for me, it is twofold in terms of what I think stands out the most from his tenure on Action Comics. Number one, to your point, is that injection of a lot of those pre-crisis aspects of the mythology that were stripped away with the John Byrne reboot. Now, we are just weeks away from our multi-episode revisitation of the whole John Byrne era. So I'm going to have a lot more to say on that front. So I don't want to spoil those episodes, but I've said this on the show before, so I think it's fine to let it fly again here. My position on Byrne, like generally at the most basic level, has been, I think a lot of the instincts were good, but I think it overshot the mark in a lot of instances. And I won't rattle all of them off now, but I do like a stronger, more confident, more capable Clark. But do I think that he needs to be the star quarterback and an accomplished reporter and an acclaimed novelist? No, I think that's overshooting the mark.
And also a lady killer too.
Yeah, that too.
Apparently, like all the women were falling over themselves for him.
That too. Do I like a story that emphasizes the humanity of the character? Yes. And I think that making Krypton more cold and sterile to create more of a contrast between Krypton and Earth, cool. But do I think that the baby not even technically being born on Krypton, never being held by Jor-El and Lara, is that overshooting the mark? Yes.
Oh, God, I got so many problems with that part of it.
And then when we get deeper into the whole post-crisis era, and you guys know, that's what I came up reading. That's near and dear to me. That's the version of the character I fell in love with. I'll always have love and affection for that. But one of the questions I have had, and I have wrestled with on this show over the years, specifically with the aspects of the mythology, Superboy and the Legion and Kandor and the Phantom Zone and Zod and Supergirl, we had all of that stripped away in the post-crisis era. But virtually all of those things came back in different, arguably lesser, but certainly more convoluted ways. I'll defend that Earthborn Angel Supergirl forever, right? So I'm not knocking it. At the same time, saying, okay, Supergirl is Superman's cousin from Krypton is a much cleaner, easier sell than Supergirl is a protoplasmic entity from a pocket universe who merged with a dying human and became an Earthborn angel. And so we would see versions of this throughout the post-crisis era where these concepts would come back in different ways. But I guess the question I've always had is, did we need to strip them away entirely and only let them come back in these kind of twisted versions? Was there not a way to incorporate it, but do it in a way that was more streamlined, that really focused on what's going to have the biggest emotional impact? Right? Kandor. We spent a lot of time talking about pre-crisis Kandor a while back. And yeah, it got silly at a certain point. Superman had multiple doppelgangers in the city. Donnell and Dixie and all these people. Most of the people of Metropolis, the supporting cast, had doppelgangers in Kandor. They were trading places all the time. In my opinion, that's too much. That gets silly. But does that mean we can't have a Kryptonian Kandor at all? That's the question that I've had. And this is a long-winded way of saying this Geoff Johns tenure, this era of Superman, I feel like kind of answers that question because I feel like he brings back a lot of those most compelling, most salient pre-crisis elements like Zod and the traditional Phantom Zone and Kandor, and Supergirl had already been back. Krypto, he brings back in Secret Origin, right? The traditional Kryptonian version of Krypto who arrives in the rocket and everything. And I think it works really well. I feel like this run essentially answers that question that I've been kicking around. So for me, that part of his run, injecting those pre-crisis elements, giving us the one true Zod, the one true Brainiac, and so on, I think that was a win from my perspective. I mean, how do you feel?
No, pretty much. I was pretty much nodding along with everything you were saying. I mean, especially the convoluted ways that they tried to introduce the stuff. I mean, my favorite was when they tried to do Zod, and it's Zod, but it's not Zod. He's like from a pocket universe, and then they bring back Zod again in that great Joe Kelly issue. He says kneel before Zod, and it's not Zod, but he was a child of some cosmonauts and who got spoken to by the pocket universe. I was like, why just let them use Zod? Come on. And
Yeah.
at some point, like you're taking the last son of Krypton idea way too literally, and I think that Kurt Busiek actually was someone who pointed this out. He's like, well, he's the last son of Krypton. It doesn't mean he's the last Kryptonian. It means he was like the last person born on Krypton. That works. That's a good way of explaining that. And yeah, I thought that, the criticisms I have of this run of issues, which for the most part I did enjoy, although I do have some, nitpicks here and there. But for the most part, I thought I agree. Yeah, I think he did a really good job of trying to fit these things in together. Secret Origin, I've got my own issues with, which we'll talk about next episode. But Brainiac, I thought was a great job of introducing that character. Zod, I have some issues with that story, but I thought like the Zod part of it, I thought was really strong. I thought they did a good job with that, and I thought they also had an interesting wrinkle with Non, with how they worked him in too, and the background of him. The Toyman stuff too, also really good job of integrating that too, and even the Legion stuff. I am on record, numerous times saying that the Legion of superheroes could disappear from the face of the earth, and all comics could be burned and I would not care because the Legion just never interested me. But I still thought he found a good way to kind of work them in a way that still fit. So yeah, I think that this is one of Johns' strengths is he can try. He loves the Silver Age stuff so much, and when he tries to, he can find a way to fit it in.
Yeah, and look, a few years ago, I would not be sitting here saying this, but I think with a lot of these Silver Age concepts, it's really intriguing to sort of dust them off and present them with modern storytelling sensibilities. It's a huge reason why I have been and remain on board with the current Action Comics stories, where we have Clark as an active, public-facing Superboy. Never would have said that a while back. But after going through all of that old material, I'm like, man, this is kind of a compelling idea to at least explore, but it would be interesting to see this done today. So I think that's where Johns really shines with these stories. But then the other major distinguishing characteristic of this, as we've been saying, is the infusion of a lot of the Superman 78 aesthetics and characterization. And I really don't find that a successful move in these stories. Even as my position on it has softened, it's still the aspect of this run that if I could change one thing, it would be that. By the way, like, I totally get it. I mean, Geoff Johns, he loves Superman the movie. He got his start as Richard Donner's assistant, and then Richard Donner comes on board here and co-writes 2 of these arcs with him. So the fact that we're getting that crystal imagery, that aesthetic, that we're getting the holographic Jor-El, that we're getting not just Zod, who had been in the comics before in various forms, but also Ursa and Non, who made their comic book debuts with this storyline, right? Like, I get it. And it's the sort of thing, if I ever had an opportunity to write a Superman story, yeah, you'd probably see a lot of nods to Smallville. You'd see Conduit in there. You'd see Superman getting thrown in the sun. And for those of you who listen to this podcast, you'd be reading those issues and be like, oh my God, this guy, of course he's going to do all this stuff. So it's like, I get it, but I just don't know how well it served the story. And I hate to be such a freaking like continuity nerd with this, but it felt like there was a dissonance between the established version of the character and what we were getting. But honestly, I don't feel like Geoff Johns and Kurt Busiek were writing the same versions of the characters in their concurrent runs. Because when you look at what Busiek was doing over in Superman, I think that the track that he took with Clark, and you see that at the end of Up, Up and Away, the storyline that the two of them wrote together. And I have to imagine that this was Busiek's influence more than Johns, because we would see it continue with the Busiek run, is that Clark, look, they wanted to move away clearly from the star reporter. Okay, right? I guess I can live with that. But I feel like Busiek's approach was more, hey, Clark's not dependable. As opposed to Johns, who really put him back in the, that stiff double-breasted blue suit, and he's tripping over himself and, again, getting chewed out by Perry and everything. And it very much harkens back to the movie, but it's not necessarily my taste. I don't feel like it lined up with the version of the character we were living with. And I guess my other more specific gripe with this is, and this comes up a lot in terms of like how Clark Kent is depicted, but I feel like if you're going with the more nebbish version of the character, or I feel like it is inherently limiting in terms of how much you can do with him, and by extension, how much you can do with the Daily Planet side of things. And I think that bears out because really, even though we're criticizing those Clark Kent scenes we got at the Planet, there are relatively few when you look at the total of Johns' work. And maybe it's just that he had other fish to fry and there just wasn't that much real estate. But I also can't help but wonder, part of the reason why we didn't see as much of that is because with that version of Clark, you can only go so far. And the last thing I'll say, right, this extends to other characters as well. I feel like Perry White regresses an insane amount, right, to a very one-note, gruff editor. Jimmy, too, I complained about this earlier, the fact that this guy seemingly can't get an in-focus photo to save his life. And it's just one of those things where if you are sort of resetting the characters, but then you're going to move them forward, that's one thing. But I don't really feel like we get that. So that's the major problem that I had, and honestly, to a large extent, still have, even now.
No, I totally co-sign all of that. I mean, Perry White, sometimes I felt like if you had drawn a mustache on him, he would be indistinguishable from J. Jonah Jameson. It's like almost the exact same personality beats. And even to the point where he says, like, when, Clark runs out or something, and he says, like, of all the men in Metropolis, Lois married Clark. I'm like, Perry White would not say that at this point in this tenure. And Jimmy Olsen, I'm like, this guy was a star reporter for GBS. I mean, come on. He's not just an errand boy anymore. And I feel like, I wonder how much of this was just Richard Donner's influence creeping in. And to a large extent, I get that. Like, it's obvious Johns has a lot of respect for Donner. I mean, he loves the guy's work. He was his assistant. And honestly, if you had me co-write a book with Grant Morrison and Morrison wanted to do stuff that I didn't agree with, that I didn't share my sensibilities, I'd still go along with it because it's like, it's Grant freaking Morrison. Of course I'm going to go along with it. So I get that. But still, I feel like this stuff with Donner, I think it would have gone over a lot better if they had just done like kind of a standalone thing.
Like Superman 78, like those miniseries that we've gotten now, 100%, right? Because when I read those, oh, and by the way, I mean, I guess this is more germane to our next conversation, but by the time Gary Frank comes aboard, he is drawing Christopher Reeve.
Oh, yeah. I'll be saying a bunch of that next time.
Right. Yeah. But when you look at something like those more recent Superman 78 miniseries written by Robert Venditti, it's like, okay, no, that's meant to be in the world of those movies. So I get that and I'm on board with it. But when you have that injected here, That's where I do kind of, bump up against it a bit. And I guess we're talking about the characterization, and I feel like this points to Geoff Johns generally. I said this before that I think he does have a knack for distilling the most salient character traits or dynamics of a character, and then really kind of making a meal of it and building out from there. I feel like Cat Grant is another example, and this is once again more relevant to sort of the next episode because she comes back at the start of that Brainiac storyline. But when she does return, she's wearing all of these revealing outfits and is kind of a harsher, like, sexed up version of the character, for lack of a better term. And I remember at the time feeling like I don't really feel like this reflects the version of Cat Grant who we spend so much time with in the Triangle era of the books. And she had been off the board for a while. And to Johns' credit, there is a line, to be perfectly honest, if I'm not mistaken, this actually might be in the Sterling Gates Supergirl run, so it might not even be Johns, but they were working closely together. But there is a line about how Cat is appearing and behaving in this way because of unprocessed grief and trauma over the death of her son, Adam Grant.
Yeah, that is in the John stuff.
That is in the John stuff.
I haven't read the Supergirl stuff, but I do remember reading that in the John stuff.
Okay, cool. So that's an instance of, I think, Johns doing what Johns does, where he's drilling down on sort of the default setting of the character, right? This more sexually aggressive, provocative version of Cat Grant. If you only know Cat Grant from Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, you'll feel right at home.
Dude, yeah, this was like Tracy Scoggins in Heat. If you remember Lois and Clark, that's saying something.
Exactly. So I feel like he distills or reverts the character back to their default setting, but to his credit, accounts for what would otherwise be a regression by incorporating a specific continuity point, the death of her son. So he does account for, well, why is she acting this way? And whether or not that's overall a successful approach, I don't know. I don't really have like a final answer on that. But I feel like Cat is kind of a good encapsulation of the general approach of Geoff Johns. It's not just like wiping the board clean, although arguably with Perry and Jimmy and Clark, there's really no accounting for why they've seemingly taken all of these steps back. So my argument only goes so far. But I do feel like Cat, in a general sense, I feel like is more representative of what Johns does with these characters.
Yeah, especially because I feel like this is both an example of the Cat example is good because it shows both the good and the bad side to what Johns does. Because on the one hand, yes, he does come up with an explanation for it, but on the other hand, it feels kind of rushed, and I feel like there's a lot more story there that could have been played around with over a few issues as like a B plot or something. But it's just basically that one conversation between Lois and Clark, and then that's it. It's gone. It's off the board. And so I feel like that's kind of an exhibit A of how Johns can be kind of a lazy writer when it comes to this thing. So he has a good explanation here, and it does make a lot of sense. I remember cluing in. I'm like, oh yeah, that does explain a lot, but I need more. I don't need you to just tell me that. I need you to show me that.
Absolutely. Now, I do want to sprinkle in some questions from our patrons, and this speaks to a big picture question that I wanted to get at. So my thanks to Jan, who said this. Geoff Johns is a contender for my favorite comics writer of all time. Brian Bendis is the other major contender, in case anyone wants to judge my boring taste. But I find it interesting how, despite having long runs on a ton of DC titles, Johns' Superman work is mostly a series of pretty self-contained stories that never feel like a run to me. This action run was so delayed and is so disjointed that I never think of it as one work, like I do his Flash or JSA tenures. I like all of his Superman stories, even Secret Origin, but why did he never have a more cohesive run on a Superman title? Now, obviously, this has been marinating for me, so I know I'm really putting you on the spot, but I guess, do you agree? Do you feel like this doesn't hold together as a cohesive run the way his others do? Like, I guess, do you agree with that? And then if so, yeah, is there a reason that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think I agree with it because it does feel like there are these. Because I had read all these stories through trades in isolation, so I didn't really know, with the exception of Superman and the Legion. I think that was the only one that I hadn't read before. but all of them, they do feel kind of disjointed, especially Up and Away feels like the biggest outlier. And then you have Last Son and Escape from Bizarro World. They're they kind of fit together a little bit, even though they're both written by Johns and Donner. They do still feel a little bit disparate. And then you've got Brainiac, and that feels also kind of separate. It feels very much like its own thing. And maybe I'm also incorporating that because of the Superman Unbound animated movie too, which is adapted from that story. And then you've got, I feel like the Legion and Secret Origin feel like they fit together a little bit better as well. So it does feel like these different pieces that it looks like it's the same puzzle, but the pieces don't quite match up.
Yeah, Jan hit the nail on the head, because this was something that I was kind of kicking around. I agree. This does not feel like a quote unquote run the way his other runs do. And I do think it's for a few reasons. Number one, by the time we get to Superman and the Legion, Gary Frank becomes his primary artistic collaborator. But that's after Up and Away, Last Son, and Escape from Bizarro World. And to be honest, I enjoy the art on all three of those preceding stories, but I do think there is something to having that artistic consistency. I think that's part of it. I think the larger issues are the ways in which Johns came on board and left, as well as significant delays to the Last Son storyline, and the way in which certain other stories were really just kind of pieces of a larger puzzle, to borrow an analogy you used. So I mentioned, the artistic side of things. But as far as just the publishing side of all of this, so Up and Away, this 8-part crossover between Superman and Action Comics that Johns co-wrote with Busiek, that came immediately after Infinite Crisis. That was their 1 year later storyline. All the books in the DC line jumped ahead 1 year. Meanwhile, you had the 52 weekly series, which we covered in another episode, that filled in the blanks for the DC universe. But that was a story that he was co-writing with another writer. Right. So I don't for myself, I don't know how much I look at Up and Away as a Geoff Johns story. We're going to talk about it as if it is, but it was a collaboration with another writer. But then there was a 3-parter that Busiek wrote in Action right after Up and Away. So there was a gap before Johns and Donner started Last Son. So I looked up the publication dates of all of this, speaking of the delays, right? So the first part of Last Son, Action 844, came out in October 2006. So 844, 845, 846 came out between October and February. Right, those were the first 3 chapters. Then part 4 was delayed and didn't come out until July in issue 851. Now, in the meantime, you had other writers, including Dwayne McDuffie, doing fill-ins in Action Comics. So we have 3 chapters, a break, part 4, and then the last 2 chapters got consolidated into that Action Comics annual, number 11. That didn't come out, until May 2008. So the Last Son storyline started in October 2006 and didn't end until May 2008. Other stories that we're talking about here started and finished in the time it took for Last Son to finish. Now, this might not mean that much to people now. And like the way you and I read this, and anyone who's new to this would read this, you read Last Son in one shot, and they're all drawn by Adam Kubert, and it's a really fun story, in my opinion, from start to finish. But those delays were significant, and especially given that we were introducing Zod and Non and Ursa and the Phantom Zone and all of this, there were major pieces that were just kind of floating out there for a while. I have to imagine that hurt a bit of the momentum. And then, mentioning things kind of being part of a larger puzzle piece here. I love Superman and the Legion. We're going to hit on that next week, but we did a whole episode last year on the Geoff Johns Legion trilogy, because you had the Lightning Saga, that crossover between Justice League and Justice Society. Then you had Superman and the Legion. And then you had Final Crisis Legion of 3 Worlds. Now, I do genuinely think Superman and the Legion holds up as its own story, but it was also the middle chapter of a trilogy that began and ended in other titles. And the Brainiac storyline, which was the last major arc in Action Comics that Geoff Johns started and finished, once again, I think a strong story in and of itself, but was also a lead-in to the New Krypton saga. And then the last thing, I mentioned the way John started on the title, but also the way it ended. And we talked about this, by the way, for anyone who's like, hey, what about New Krypton? We did 2 episodes on New Krypton a while back. So after you're done listening to these 2 Superman by Jeff Johns episodes, go check out the New Krypton installments. But he ends up writing the part of the New Krypton special, and he writes, I think, 3 issues of Action Comics in the New Krypton saga, and then he's just gone. And I don't think that was the original plan. I think the intention was for him to do vastly more, if not all of New Krypton. But he ends up just stepping aside right after that epic saga gets started. So I think for all of those reasons, this doesn't have that same cohesive feel. Oh, the last thing, this is important. So Superman's Secret Origin, his and Gary Frank's retelling of the origin, you might have expected that to come first in all of this, but it's the last thing published. So well after the Brainiac storyline and the New Krypton saga is underway, in 2009, we finally get the 6-issue Secret Origin. I think had that come at the beginning, I think that would have bookended the entire run. So I feel like those are all kind of reasons why, to Jan's question, like it doesn't feel like a run.
It's funny because I actually read these in like continuity order, I guess you call it, because I read Secret Origin first and then I went on to Up and Away and from there on. So yeah, man, that's wild. Especially because I figured with the Legion stuff that was mentioned in the with the Legion stuff in Secret Origin, and then what happens in Superman and the Legion, I figured that was after, or at least concurrently, when Johns was doing Secret Origin. So I was kind of surprised. I'm kind of surprised to find out that it actually came after those.
It's wild. I mean, look, we know as of this recording, we know we're getting at least volume 1 of a New Krypton omnibus, which does include the Brainiac arc. I truly hope that we ultimately get a Superman by Jeff Johns omnibus. And if and when we do, were I to be in charge of the mapping, I would 100% put Secret Origin at the beginning. I would not go.
Are we manifesting again?
Listen, I'm going to put it out there. So DC, if you're listening and you do this, please put Secret Origin at the beginning. All right, we've hit on a lot, and we've talked about a lot of these kind of big picture things. Let's drill down more specifically on these 3 stories for this episode here. So Up and Away, which picks up with Superman 1 year after the events of Infinite Crisis. He's been powerless for that year, and by all accounts, man, it's been a great year for Clark Kent, the reporter, and for the marriage between Clark and Lois. I mean, he's been delivering all these exposés on Intergang and really earning a lot of favor with Perry. And then over the course of the story, we see his powers start to return, just as we see Lex Luthor initially escape the criminal justice system. But rather than sort of return to that post-crisis CEO iteration of the character, we really see him spun into more of a pre-crisis mode as the renegade scientist. And he uses the Sunstone crystal that he recovered from the remains of Superman's prior fortress to unearth and activate, I think, Admiral Zod's ancient Kryptonian warship, and use it to attack Metropolis. And those are sort of the broad strokes of the story. But yeah, I mean, what did you make of this one?
Well, first, I did want to ask you about the Zod thing. Like, was that supposed to be, I wasn't sure because the Admiral thing was throwing me off. Was that supposed to be the Zod, or was that supposed to be Zod's ancestor?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess, yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was meant to be an ancestor. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good question. Or just at that point in time, he hadn't yet ascended the ranks. So no, not positive.
Okay. So yeah, that was one question I had. But man, I love this story. Like when you said it was 8 parts, I was kind of surprised because I've read it twice and I blew through it both times because it's such an engaging read. I feel like, I feel like the collaborators Johns has are really kind of like influencing him in different ways. And I feel like Busiek was a lot of influence on him in this arc, and I think that it was a lot of a good influence because I feel like they bring in some of those Silver Age stuff, like they introduce the Kryptonian man, or the Kryptonite man. Although one of the questions I always had is why did they never just call Conduit the Kryptonite man? Because it just seemed so obvious to me when I first heard about that character.
Fair.
But I thought this was such a great arc. I love the character stuff. I love the idea of, Clark, even though now he is human and he gets to just experience what it's like to be human, but he's not and I feel like this is a strength about Superman's character is like he always wants to help, no matter what ability and whatever his abilities allow him to help, he'll do. So in this case, it's being the reporter. It's going and doing all these exposés. It's having a line to all these superheroes in the community, and I thought it was a great distillation of Clark and Lois and their dynamic, especially when we get to the part where Lois is talking about how she's, she's enjoyed the fact that for the past year, she hasn't had to share her husband with anybody. And I mean, anybody who has kids can, relate to that in some level because it's tough when you got to share your partner with other people. And especially so when he's, the world's greatest hero. So you can't even imagine how difficult that would be. So when his powers start to come back and he tells Lois about it, right? And you can tell it's not really, and this is one of the things I love when Jeff Johns doesn't tell us, he shows us, and with him not telling Lois right away, and then she discovers because he has his hand on the burner and he doesn't realize it, and then she's like, "Oh, your powers are back," and he's like, "Yeah, they've been coming back for a while," and he's nervous about this. You can tell he's nervous about telling her about this, and she just walks into the other room and he's trying to explain it. She just says, "I just have 3 words for you. Go get him." And she just gives him the costume. And then she whispers to him and she talks to him after he's flying away. And she says, "Yeah, I loved having you here, but you know what? I get it. I know I knew I was marrying Superman when I did, and I know that now, and you have to be who you are. And I love you for that." And I thought that was such a great distillation of their relationship because you can feel that you can really sympathize with Lois in that instance and with Clark too. Like, yeah, it's a bummer that you're not going to have that shared private time anymore. But at the same time, they're also adults and they also understand. She knows what she got herself into. So I thought that was one of my favorite parts of this whole run.
100%. I love that whole dynamic because, yeah, you see that powers or not, he's always going to be a hero. And now he has the opportunity to really focus on his journalistic side and write all these exposés, which is great. I agree with you. I love Lois's response to this because I feel like were Clark to be overly reluctant about returning to duty or were Lois to be poo-pooing the idea, I feel like that would just be I feel like it would not ring true and would just sort of be this false forced conflict because we know what we're building towards. And I feel like they know themselves and each other well. And that's what comes across here. And yeah, I mean, I like this mode for Clark because we get information through dialogue and flashbacks. Once his powers were gone at the end of Infinite Crisis, after he and the Superman of Earth 2 and Superboy Prime passed through the Red Sun, it's not like he didn't try to get them back. Star Labs and all these other heroes, including the Ray, right? Other heroes with solar-based powers. They tried to get to the bottom of this, but it was just this idea like his cells were not charging up again. So it wasn't like he was purposely relinquishing these powers or refusing to take them on again, but it just physically was not happening. So he turned his attention to how he could serve in a different way. And one of the things I loved about this story is we have the inclusion of Green Lantern, Hal Jordan, and Hawkgirl, and they assist Clark at a critical point. But I think that issue ends with Hal offering Clark a Green Lantern ring. It's like, hey, like, this is what you do. Like, this is a way to get you back out there. And Clark does try on the ring and glows green and everything, but there's no big S, right? And that's something he and Lois talk about, where when he put on that ring and the aura manifested around him, it presumably was to show or reveal him the way he sees himself. And at that point, he didn't see himself as Superman. So he turned that down, which was interesting. But I'm glad the story broached that subject because it's not. I mean, it's funny. It's not something that I don't think I would have questioned it if the story didn't include it. But the fact that it did, I'm like, oh yeah, like that is actually if he can't be Superman, there are other means in this wider DC universe. So I love that they included that. But yeah, man, I love this story. I feel like Up, Up and Away is such an underrated story. And look, it's not the case where the Action Comics issues are credited to Jeff Johns and the Superman issues are credited to Busiek. Both of them are credited as writers for all 8 of the parts. And I don't want to misattribute credit but I really feel like the parts that resonate the most with me, I feel like they're Busiek. The narration, Clark's inner monologue, that's something that Busiek would continue in his Superman run, but would not be part of the Geoff Johns action run. So I have to imagine that was Kurt's contribution. I could be wrong, but that's kind of my read on it. I remember, I'm even as a kid, I mean, I'm a high schooler, but I remember there's a line in one of the issues where Clark is like, I'm going to go to the video store and check out the latest box sets of TV. He's like, I can't believe all the shows I used to miss. I remember reading that for the first time, just identifying so much. I'm like, oh yeah, he's like me. He loves getting his TV shows on DVD, but there was just such a humanity. The pretzel cart vendor, which may be a bit of a precursor to what we would see in the new James Gunn Superman movie.
Dude, I was thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah, but the fact that, he has this hankering for these pretzels, but that Superman actually knows this vendor by name. And at the end of the story, we see Clark get a pretzel early in the story, but then at the end, we see the pretzel cart vendor give Superman one, and he brings it to the site of his new fortress. But it's just great. The Clark moment that I think resonated the most with me, aside from the box sets, was early on, Lex and his guys grab Clark and rough him up, because he's been writing all of these stories about Lex. And Lex, even though he's beaten the charges against him, he has been ousted from his company. And over the course of the story, we'll see him go underground to his labs and hatch this plan to unearth Zod's warship and all of that. But they rough Clark up. And then there's a conversation between Clark and Lois after. And she's like, man, you've got 20 pounds on, Lex. You're in great shape. Why didn't you fight back? And he goes, I did. My article about Lex ran in the paper today. And if that doesn't say everything about the character, or at least the Clark side of the character, I don't know what does.
No, I think that's exactly what I was saying before about the Superman animated series version of the character, where he's got this quiet confidence. And, the George Reeves Superman, Clark Kent, probably would have fought back, or even, even the John Byrne one probably would. But the Superman the animated series version, he's going to fight back in a different way. He's not going to fight back physically. He's going to fight back using the best tools at his disposal, which is his tools as a journalist. And I thought that was a great moment as well. I clocked that too. And I think you're right. I think Busiek is a really powerful force in this arc. I wasn't really keyed into what the differences were between the Superman and the Action Comics issues, because I was just all reading it as a piece, and I wasn't paying attention to the I don't even think that mentions necessarily which ones are which here.
No, they're both. They're both credited with each issue.
But even like on you see the image breaks, the cover breaks, but I don't see any credit on these. So it doesn't say which one is Superman, which one is Action Comics. So it all fit together pretty seamlessly. But when you compare it to the other stuff that we've read for this episode, this really felt different. It really felt like it stood apart from the others. And I feel like Busiek is a major reason for that. And Busiek is a really great writer. And I feel like more so than Grant Morrison or Geoff Johns, or even to a certain extent, even Mark Waid, I feel like Busiek is exceptionally well about pulling stuff from the past, but still making it feel modern. Like, I think that's one of the reasons why I loved his Avengers run so much, and why it was a perfect introduction to the Avengers for me, who had never read the Avengers before. And so then when I went back and I read these older Avengers comics, I'm like, oh, I see what he was doing there. Whereas with Johns and Waid and Morrison, these other writers, as much as I love them, I do feel like sometimes their fandom can kind of get the better of themselves sometimes.
Aw Yeah Comics celebrates everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, Muncie, Indiana, or Skokie, Illinois, home to our pal, Sweet Sweet Bernie. If you have children and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow them on social media. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. Fat Moose Comics, established in 1982, is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Led by current owner Sean Hendricks, Moose has that rare, old-school comic shop feel and camaraderie, yet also remains a welcoming space for new fans. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, They can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you are in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. We all love the big-budget superhero films, but the world of independent cinema remains a place of unbridled creative freedom and entrepreneurial spirit. Whether you're an independent filmmaker yourself, or you just love movies, don't miss these New Jersey film festivals. Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, and Round Reel in Bloomfield. Submission information for filmmakers can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and much more. We love digging into epic comic book runs, but what about the art of the single issue? Single Bound is a new podcast series hosted by married couple Amy and Logan as they review single issues of comics. And if the title also makes you think of Superman, you're not alone, as the Man of Steel is Logan's favorite character and a regular topic of discussion on Single Bound. Listen and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube, and follow the show on Instagram at Single Bound Podcast. Look, I think part of the reason why we have the complaints we do about Perry and Jimmy later, and Jimmy in particular, is that in this story, I mean, you see him in the trenches with Clark, getting the shot, but then even more importantly, when we get to the climax of the story, when Superman has his powers back and he's battling Lex, and Lex is in the warship and pummeling him with kryptonite, Jimmy jumps in front with a trash can lid. I think he has
trash can lid. Yeah, he steps up.
Right.
And he's like, it's just kryptonite. It won't hurt me, but it'll hurt. And he's like, it's still freaking hot, man.
Yeah. I mean, and his arm gets burned. But he steps.
And badly, he says 3rd-degree burns. Jesus, that's nothing to shy at.
Yeah, but I mean, he puts himself in the line of fire to protect his pal. And later, Superman has a moment with him. He thanks him, and he gives him a new signal watch. So I just feel like you see a much more competent, mature Jimmy in this initial post-Infinite Crisis story that just goes away in these later John stories. But I love the way this played out here. The other thing, too, talking about the fact that Clark's been powerless, I like that the story never really gives you a 100% explicit answer for what this is about. I mean, Clark, I think, surmises that maybe it was more of a mental block. He wasn't ready for his powers to return. And then we get these early indications, like you said, with his hand on the stove and his computer's on the fritz, which points maybe to something else about his expanded mental capabilities, which we can circle back to. But things really start to lock in when he gets hit by a train, right? And then his powers start to reemerge. And then very shortly after that, he has to rescue Jimmy from a speeding bullet. And that's when he really sort of returns to full force. But I mean, what's your read on it? Do you think it was more of a mental issue or a physical one or a little bit of both? Like what's your ultimate read on? Because I think the story allows you to kind of draw your own conclusion on it.
Yeah, I feel like it's definitely... I feel like it started off as a physical thing, just kind of like what they said. And then over time, I feel like he had just kind of, because he'd been through the ringer in Infinite Crisis, right? You lost Connor, had all this stuff with an alternate universe Superboy, and then his alternate universe Earth 1 version, or Earth 2, I can't remember whichever one it was. And buried them both. So he gets to see like the worst part of his young self. He also gets to see his older self, and both of them, end up sacrificing themselves, plus his protege. And it's just like, that's a lot, dude. I mean, he's been put through the ringer. So I can feel like there's probably some part of him, some subconscious part of him, just like, I need a break. I just gotta. And it's only when Lex comes back, like it's just like, okay, now shit's gotten real. So I feel like that the return of Lex Luthor and all that, and I feel like the story does a good way. I'm glad the story did include that suggestion that maybe it is some sort of subconscious mental block, because otherwise it would feel extremely coincidental for his powers to come back just as Lex Luthor comes back. So I thought that was a good touch. And I really do feel like it was some sort of subconscious block, and then everything else other people had in hand. And then once Lex Luthor comes back and everything goes to hell, now this is a job for Superman. So he has to come back now.
Yeah, no, I agree with your read on that. So it's funny. So we're dealing with a story where Superman has been gone a while, and then he returns. And we also have a a Lex returning to his villainous ways and getting a hold of Kryptonian technology, the ship in particular that can expand. It's seemingly as large as a landmass. It's infinitely customizable and programmable. I don't know if you were mindful of the dates that these issues came out and if it called to mind anything else. No?
Not at all.
Okay, so these issues came out between March and June 2006. Well, what came out later in 2006? Superman Returns.
I felt like there probably was some Superman Returns influence, especially when I was noticing the shading detail on the S Shield, because it was very reminiscent of kind of like the 3D design of the S Shield on Superman Returns.
Yeah, and it's the sort of thing, I don't know to what extent this was conscious synergy or if it was just kind of in the air, or I don't know, but it was just interesting to me, and that I clocked the dates and I'm like, oh yeah, I mean, this whole idea like Superman's back very much tied in with what people were seeing on the big screen. And again, this mode for Lex, it wasn't a real estate scheme in this comic book story, but just kind of seeing him in that massive crystal ship, still just kind of called to mind the movie a bit. And then kind of on that note, I feel like this is the other, big part of the story is the Lex side of things. And we're not yet at Last Son with Richard Donner co-writing, but even as early as Up and Away, we see this infusion of that crystal aesthetic and motif, right, to represent Kryptonian technology. So I feel like already they were leaning into it, maybe because of Superman Returns, maybe because Johns had an eye on what he was hoping to do in Action Comics later. I don't know. But how did you feel about this Lex? Because it's not like they completely wipe away what came before. He was the CEO, right? But it's just like he's not going to return to that. And now we're going to see him in a bit of a different mode than we had seen him in the post-crisis era. Did you like this turn for Lex?
I thought it was. I'm not sure if I would have liked it long term, but I thought for what we were dealing with here and what he's coming off of, I feel like there was probably a little bit more ground to cover with the whole fact that he's been acquitted now, and then Metropolis still doesn't believe him. I feel like that part of it was kind of rushed through because they wanted to get to the mad scientist part. But overall, for this story, I thought it made sense, and I thought that the point Lois makes to Clark, and then which later Superman makes to Lex himself, is Lois says that Lex once said that he could cure cancer if not for Superman distracting him, and then Superman calls him out on that. He's like, "Where's the cure for cancer, Lex? Right? All this stuff. I was gone for a year, and you didn't do any of the things that you said you were going to do." And he still has hope, right? He still says, "I know you could do so much more," and he still had even after Lex has completely proven that he's not going to change, like there's still a part of Clark that's like, just maybe, right? Just that eternal optimist. I love that part of it too. So, is this my favorite depiction of Lex? No, but I thought for this story, I thought it worked really well.
Yeah, I agree. And hey, credit where credit's due. I talked about Birthright so many times, but Birthright had come out a few years before this, and that did essentially fuse the businessman and the scientist versions of Lex, where you saw him with more scientific acumen than you had seen him in the post-crisis era. But yeah, I mean, I feel like they really lean into it here, really hearkening back more to the pre-crisis era of the character. The more scientific bent, the renegade underground in his criminal lab version of the character. Overall, I was cool with it. I very much liked exactly what you called out. The fact that Superman point blank says is like, you said you could do all these things. You had a year. You did nothing, right? All you did was try to get revenge on the city. I do think my memory on 52 is a little hazy. I do think they did spend time on that, on his trial in 52, unless I'm totally misremembering. Because I remember there was this business about they basically pinned everything on Alexander Luthor.
Yes, I do remember that too. And my memory was, I thought it came from this arc. And when I was reading through this again, I missed it on the first read. And then on the second read through, I'm going like, oh wait, they don't mention it here. So I guess it probably did happen in 52 is where I'm remembering it from.
Yeah. And it's funny with Lex. I mean, Birthright had already reestablished a past between Clark and Lex in Smallville. And then Secret Origin down the line will further reaffirm that. And we don't necessarily get that called out in Up and Away, but that's still kind of the version of the character we're dealing with. But Yeah, I mean, he espouses a lot of that rhetoric that we typically hear from Lex about how Superman is stymieing human progression because he's there, but also he's gotten in Lex's way, and the city used to belong to Lex, and now it doesn't. And Superman has this whole bit about they don't belong to you and they don't belong to me, which is an idea to really kind of bookend things, I guess. We would get a very similar sentiment in Secret Origin.
Mhm.
When Superman is talking to the people and he's like, stop looking for a savior. It's not Lex and it's not me. You need to help yourselves, basically. But no, I love their interactions. And probably my favorite thing though, is when Superman, he braves the kryptonite and he shoots himself through the warship and grabs Lex, and they're falling. And there's just like a silent beat. And then Lex just goes, I hate you.
Love that part. I love that part as well too. I thought that was just such a perfect moment between the two. But another thing I wanted when you mentioned Birthright, it clued me into something else. Is that the plot Lex has in Up, Up and Away? It's very similar to his plot in Birthright, right? Using Kryptonian technology and all this to attack the city and all that. And I'm just like, it kind of gave me, you know, Force Awakens vibes, where it's like they've got another planet killer weapon and everything like that. So it's very kind of similar. It did kind of feel like a soft reboot of the post-crisis Superman with that.
Yeah, I'll have more to say on that front when we hit on Secret Origin next time. But yeah,
Oh
like
yeah.
I agree very much. I guess I welcome any other thoughts you have about Up, Up and Away. But I guess the last like big thing for me is just this idea of the super mind, right? Because hand in hand with the physical powers reemerging, there's also the sense that his mental capabilities have increased significantly. I don't really care for this. He's able to process, just untold amounts of information and retain all of it. There's the memory component, but yeah, I don't really care for this. But I don't feel like this really goes anywhere. I mean, I have not gone back to the Busiek stuff in a while, so maybe it plays out more there. But at least in all the John stuff that we read, I don't feel like his super mind is really a thing at all.
No, not really. I feel like this was something that was maybe introduced just as kind of like a hint of bringing in more of the pre-crisis, more of the pre-crisis, you could argue, overpowered version of the character compared to the post-crisis version. Um, but yeah, I wasn't really keen on that either. I didn't really think it added a whole lot to this story. But also, too, the interfering with technology portion of it, that felt like a really weird detail to the point that he has to have Ma send him a typewriter. I mean, come on.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I feel like that was a non-starter, honestly. But I mean, Up, Up and Away, like those are the main things that I guess I wanted to cite. But for anyone who hasn't read it, it's worth a read. It's a fun story. Yes, it is very much. It has a mechanical function in that it's the post Infinite Crisis story. It needs to return. It needs to bring Superman back, right? It needs to give Clark his powers back, and so that's the function that it ultimately needs to serve. But it's genuinely a solid story, especially if you want to see Clark as the reporter going up against Intergang. Intergang sends people after him. Lex goes after him, and like we said, seeing these powers return and then contend with Lex in that warship in a way that, yes, in certain respects is kind of reminiscent of Superman Returns, which may or may not be a selling point for folks, but. Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is one that kind of flies under the radar a bit, but people should not sleep on it. Anything else you want to say before we segue to Last Son?
No, I pretty much, co-sign all of that. And, even though I'm going to criticize kind of the Donner influence when we get to Last Son, I did think the incorporating the Sunstone and the way they kind of explained it made a lot more sense than it ever made sense in the movies. And honestly, I'm not a I don't know if I want the crystal design of all of Krypton to be like the permanent thing that stays in, but I really like that design for the forest. I think it's just, very stunning. So I think that part of it I'm definitely a fan of. So yeah, I dug the story. I thought it made good use of villains. It introduced, we got Lex here, obviously. We have the Toy Man robot, the Toy Boy or whatever he's called. We had we get Metallo back in. We get a bunch of other ones. We get the Kryptonite Man for the first time too, and two, we get to see like other heroes being involved here. So it's like, what happens when Superman's not around? Well, other heroes respect him enough, so he's still going to be able to get help some way. So I did like that aspect too, that we're touching on other things and his relationship to the larger superhero community. And I feel like maybe in some way that aspect of it might have influenced what James Gunn did in Superman and why he chose to have the Justice Gang and that kind of stuff in there.
Right? I know. I between that and again, that pretzel cart vendor, I really said to myself, was this a direct influence? Not that he couldn't have come up with these things otherwise, but it was with the movie on the brain and then rereading this. I'm like, oh man, I really some connective tissue here. All right. So that's the beginning of this Geoff Johns tenure. But like we said, it's this co-written story. Then we have a few months with Busiek writing a 3-parter in Action. But then Action 844 kicks off this much delayed Last Son storyline, co-written by Donner and Geoff Johns and drawn by Adam Kubert. And the broad strokes of this is that a Kryptonian boy crash lands in Metropolis. After first being taken in by the government, he's ultimately cared for by Lois and Clark. It turns out he is from the Phantom Zone and is the son of Zod and Ursa. And unbeknownst to this boy, who's really just a pawn in his parents' plans, the ship that brought him through the Phantom Zone to Earth serves as this tether and is able to bring Zod and Non and Ursa and the rest of their allies from the Phantom Zone to invade Earth. And for a stretch, Superman himself is stuck in prison in the Phantom Zone, where he reunites with Mon-El. Another injection of pre-crisis continuity. There was a post-crisis version of Mon-El, Valor, right? It's not like the character was completely gone, but this really brought back like the classic version of Mon-El, who was exposed to lead and had to go into the Phantom Zone to stay alive, or to whatever extent you're alive in the Phantom Zone until Superman could find a cure. So those are kind of the broad strokes of the story. And we have a couple more patron questions here that I want to sprinkle in here. So a real quick one first from Brian Dempsey. Bearded Jor-El or clean shaven? And why do you think they decided to make Jor-El more distinguished, so to speak? What do you prefer there, Perry?
Well, you see me right here on the video, so I'm obviously I'm a champion of the bearded gentleman. So yeah, definitely. I like the bearded look for him.
I like the bearded look. I like that as well. I mean, why do I think they did that? I think whether it was a choice or a likeness issue, I think it was a way to not make him look exactly like Marlon Brando. And I like it. I'm a fan of the bearded look. Brian continues. The Last Son story gets a lot of attention for Donner, Johns, and bringing the Phantom Zone trio into continuity. However, Brian Azzarello introduced Zod in the Phantom Zone during For Tomorrow. Does he get the honor of officially reintroducing a Kryptonian Zod back into continuity? No, I would say. I would say no. It's been a while since I looked at For Tomorrow, but I do think the intention with that it was like an alternate version of the Phantom Zone. I don't think it was like the one true version. I think the For Tomorrow Zod falls into that same category of interim Zods that you were mentioning earlier. Mm-hmm. The Pocket Universe Zod, the Pokolistani Zod, and then the For Tomorrow Zod. I think they all are kind of in that same category.
That was generally my understanding as well. Although I do echo Brian's confusion, because at the time when I had first read For Tomorrow and then I heard about Last Son and I saw that last page of the first issue, I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here? So his confusion is definitely understandable.
Yeah. So building off of this, I think we already have our answer, but it's still worth posing this, especially as a tee up to the Toyman discussion we'll have next time. Brian's last point is, I'm a little surprised that Johns didn't address past Zods as not the real Zod, his go-to move when he revamps a villain, especially considering the other two were not that far off in the publication history. Do you think that was because Infinite Crisis cleared the board for classic Zod, or Johns just couldn't come up with a good way to write them off? Or maybe we, the fans, were already primed to simply accept this version of Zod.
The story, the other stories, they said it themselves, right? That those weren't necessarily like the canon Zod, right? The original one from the Burn run was a Pocket Universe Zod. The Return to Krypton one obviously was, the Brainiac simulation or whatever it was. And then we had Pokolistan, obviously, and we just talked about For Tomorrow. So yeah, I think Johns actually didn't have to. He already had the easy out there.
100%. Like when we get to Brainiac next time, when we get to when we get to Toyman next time, it's like, yeah, there were specific versions he wanted to to retcon or at least account for, but those versions were intended to be and presented as the true versions of those characters when they appeared, as opposed to Zod. Like we said, every single one of them was accounted for in some way, shape, or form as not being the quote unquote true Zod. So I think that's why he didn't have to delve into this. But yeah, I mean, I really like this story. I really dig it a lot. This whole adopted son angle and just kind of giving us those classic presentations of the villains. Even though I still remain somewhat mixed on how heavily it leans on the movies, but still, I think it worked effectively here. What were your overall thoughts on Last Son?
Well, like I said, I loved it the first time I read it, but and I think in a vacuum, yes, it's a great story. And I think I mostly agree with you, but it's just that, especially right after it's just like from the start, it feels like Johns is basically, thumbing his nose at the entire post-crisis continuity. Because, Jor-El says, it's been a while since you've acted. So, like, my first read going into this, when I first was reading it this time, I'm like, oh, well, now he has the Sunstone. So this is his first time activating it. And now he's meeting the Jor-El AI for the first time. But no, Jor-El says to him, you haven't activated this simulation in some time. Like, okay, that's new. And then he says, you know, I lived as one of them. And, this whole idea that you are not one of them. And then we go straight into the Daily Planet thing with, like we talked about, the Perry and Jimmy of it all, and Clark being a much more nebbish version. And that threw me for a loop, and it almost kind of soured my opinion on the rest of it. Not to the point that I wasn't able to enjoy it, but it's just so jarring and it's even within the context of this run, even within the context of Up, Up, and Away, it feels jarring. Just like the treatment of the characters and where it fits in with continuity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's valid. I don't know. I mean, if anyone feels otherwise, please let us know. But I feel like it's a valid critique to have because, like we're saying, it's not even just that it doesn't align with what came before Infinite Crisis. It doesn't align with the story that Johns co-wrote a few months earlier. And, it's funny. I was trying to find interviews that Johns did at the time, and I found one with Superman homepage. And it was while Up, Up, and Away was coming out, or maybe even right before it started. And he was asked about whether he has plans beyond Up, Up, and Away, and he didn't give a firm answer. I mean, I don't know. Part of me wonders, did this larger action tenure come about maybe more quickly than we're thinking? Because my point is, I feel like I would like to think, this is what I'm trying to get at. I would like to think that if Johns knew that, okay, I'm going to be on Action Comics, I'm really going to be pulling from the Donner movies, that would have been established immediately after Infinite Crisis. Because towards the conclusion of Infinite Crisis, we get the formation of New Earth. We see some of the glimpses of the revised continuity. We see Clark as Superboy. We see Wonder Woman as a founding member of the Justice League. It's like, that could have been an opportunity to say, okay, like we're reverting to this nebbish characterization of Clark Kent and so on. But they didn't do that. So it's like, I just wonder, I don't know what happened there. I would be curious to know, because it is kind of curious.
Well, yeah, I agree. And I think that the buzz around Superman Returns plus the Donner cut coming out.
Right.
And I feel like that opened the door for maybe Johns to pick up the phone and call and go to DC and maybe say like, hey, why don't we try and maybe they had like a gap in the schedule or something like, and John's like, well, what if we get Dick to come on and do something? And they're like, okay, well, with all the Donner cut buzz and everything, maybe he called up Richard Donner, or maybe Richard Donner picked up the phone, or something happened. I think because of what was happening at the time, what was in the air, that was the impetus for this arc. And I don't feel like this was planned when Up, Up, and Away, because even, like we said with Up, Up, and Away, the whole point of the whole thing about Lex saying that he could have cured cancer and all that, and then he does it. Lex says that here. He brings it up right to Superman's face after Superman called him out on it. And reading these back to back, I'm just like, wait a minute. Lex, you're just saying the exact same thing Superman just called you out on. So it does feel like that. Yeah, it does feel like this stuff was not planned out, and that this is just kind of not necessarily thrown together, because I do think they did do good work on this, right? Doesn't it? But it does feel like something that it was not planned out as far as Infinite Crisis, or even as far as Up and Away.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's the only conclusion you can really draw, but moving beyond that, although again, I think our gripes are warranted, but
Well, I do have one minor
yeah.
gripe here.
Yeah, go for
and
it.
this is something, and this is not necessarily specific to Johns or Donner, but this is just something that's been going on in the Superman books for a while, and I hate it. I hate the Kryptonian language being called Kryptonese. It feels very odd to me. It feels like you call everything else Kryptonian. Why wouldn't the language be Kryptonian? That's just a minor gripe, but I
All
just had to
right,
get
fair
that off my
enough.
chest.
That's never bumped me, but fair enough. Yeah. I mean, I guess overall, I really liked all of the business to do with the young boy. We'll learn his true name is Lorzod, but the Lois and Clark will name him Christopher, presumably in a nod to Christopher Reeve, which is a very nice touch. It's wild kind of going back and looking at the story now, knowing what we know about where the characters will go, the fact that they will ultimately have their own biological son, John Kent. But yeah, here we have this young boy who crash lands at Metropolis, origins unknown, but he speaks Kryptonese, like you said, and displays power. So very quickly is identified as likely being Kryptonian. And I do love the end of that first chapter, I believe, where Clark disguises himself in this black outfit and ski mask, and he attacks the military convoy that's moving the boy because the government moved him without Superman's knowledge. So I love the fact that, well, first I love the righteous anger that he displays towards Sarge Steele when he realizes that the boy's not there, but then the means that he resorts to, adopting this other disguise and using smoke bombs and everything to get the boy back. I mean, it felt like, yeah, this is a guy who's friends with Batman, and like when he needs to, like, he'll do what he needs to do. So I really like that. And then you also have these great scenes with Lois and Clark and the Kents at the farm. So it's mostly Clark at the planet where I have the biggest issue. But once we got to the farm and Clark is himself, it felt much more in keeping with the characters that we know.
No, I agree. I love the righteous anger part. Like, one of the criticisms of Superman in recent years is that he's become too much of, uh, enforcing authority and all that kind of stuff. And this flies right in the face of that, right? He bursts in there and he slams Sarge Steele up against the wall, and he's like, "You're going to tell me where this kid is," right? And then when they say like, "Oh, there's nothing you can do about it," he goes up, uses smoke bombs, goes and disguises himself, and gets him out. And that shows, first off, Clark is his own man. He's going to do what he thinks is right. Damn the consequences. Damn what anyone says differently. But also, he's a smart guy, right? He's not going to. He is conscious of the heat he's going to be calling upon himself if he does this in a public way. So he's going to do it in a way using subterfuge. So I thought that was a nice touch as well. And yet, I mean, I think the only real gripe I had with the conversation with Lois and the Kents was Lois's line about how um, um, people like Ma and Pa were put on this earth to be good parents. We weren't. I mean, I sympathize on one hand because I used to be that person myself, and now I've got two kids, and maybe it's just that. Maybe it's just me hating that old version of myself, but there's part of me that's just like, I don't know. I mean, I can understand Lois, but Clark, I mean, if anyone is like the candidate for like world's best dad, even before he became a dad, it would be Clark Kent.
I hear you. I mean, I guess I read that less as kind of any sort of critique of their character and more just their lives, their lifestyles. Like it just would not be conducive to that. But yeah, like I said, it's just particularly wild knowing where we'll go. Like, it's just interesting to broach this subject with these characters at an earlier point in time, years before John Kent would enter the picture. I mean, I do like, and it does track to me that Lois would be the more reticent one, but then certainly she forms her attachment with Chris. And yeah, to your point of Superman using these clandestine means to get the boy back, but then he ends up using public attention because he calls this press conference and his whole idea is like, hey, I'm going to announce to the world where you're taking him to keep you honest to Sarge Steele. But then, of course, Lex sends Bizarro, to try to get the boy back, and we have this whole battle. And then that's when Clark changes course, and instead of handing the boy back over to the government, he and Lois take him in. And this leads to our last patron question here. And this is a big picture idea, and this has come up a number of times, and this is as perfect a time as any to really kind of dig into it a little bit more. So this is from our pal Duncan, who says, I am a huge fan of the adoption element of the Superman story. And I do think of it largely as a beautiful adoption story, which is why the new movie works perfectly for me with its nurture over nature themes, and explains why I like Man of Steel as an origin and definitely prefer it over Secret Origin, which feels like an attempt to smush Smallville and Superman 78 together for me. I do love young Jonathan Kent as a character, and I love the boys on Superman and Lois, but I have to say I think John's got it spot on here. Having Lois and Clark adopt Christopher, as they couldn't have their own kids, is such a beautiful and poignant story point. And with him being a Zod, it really adds an extra layer to that nurture over nature theme. Clark's own life is defined by being taken in by loving parents who weren't his by blood, so seeing him and Lois step into that role feels like the most natural extension of who Clark is at his core. It's almost like he's closing a loop, giving back the exact kind of unconditional love that shaped him. What do you think? Do we lose something if they can just have kids?
Oh, that's a really good question. Um, I mean, he, I don't know if we necessarily lose something, but at the same time, I think he makes a really good point. I mean, I think that is a really beautiful idea. The fact that he's returning the favor that the Kents gave him, and he's paying it forward. Yeah, there is something beautiful about that. I mean, I don't think him and Lois being able to conceive necessarily diminishes that idea, or if we lose anything with that, but I do think it is. Yeah, that he's kind of running me speechless a little bit here. I think he came up with a good idea there.
Yeah, I mean, cheers, Duncan. I think that's a very compelling argument, and it's not the first time this has come up. It's funny at the time, and even upon recent rereads of this, I don't know that I've gotten too hung up on how Chris Kent is discarded. I mean, he will ultimately come back in New Krypton and all of that, but still, that's kind of the end of his story. And I know now there is the son of Zod who is part of the current continuity, but it's not necessarily the version who was Chris Kent, unless I'm mistaken. But reading it now, yes, I can't help, and I love John Kent too, but I can't help but feel that they unnecessarily took Chris Kent off the board. I think that, I mean, Duncan really summed it up best. I think there's something very fitting about Clark, yes, returning that favor, taking in someone else the same way he was taken in. The fact that the boy is Kryptonian, yet comes from his greatest enemies, but is trying to carve his own path. There's a lot to explore there. I mean, it's one of those things, not to get too nerdy about this, but we've examined this as well over the years. It's like, yeah, realistically, would Lois and Clark be able to biologically have their own child? Probably not. And yes, there are, ways in which, it happens when he doesn't have his powers and this and that. But
Man of Steel, Windham Kleenex.
Yeah, but like overall, logically, adoption probably makes more sense from them. And this still allows them to have a Kryptonian child, which I do think is important, right? I do feel like a key aspect of this is that he's raising a child, they're raising a child who has these same powers. Now, a counterpoint, I suppose, is with John, you do get the fact that it's human and Kryptonian. But at this, I mean, I don't know. I'd have to bone up on my John Kent stories. I mean, I feel like at least now he's usually presented as being pretty comparable power-wise to his dad, right? I mean,
Yeah, as far as I know, yeah. I mean, I think the thing about John that them having is that it really works for the immigrant angle of Superman's story, because it is this idea of, he came from somewhere else. But he was raised here. He grew up here. He feels like one of us, and he's becoming a member of society, and he is contributing in different ways. And one of those ways is in terms of having children. And so there's that aspect of it too. Just like the intercultural marriage aspect of that. And, then you have Jonathan as a child of two cultures then as well. So there's that aspect of it. Another thing too, that I think would be interesting is, now that we're talking about this, is it would have been cool if Chris stuck around and then we also got Jonathan there too, because that would have created a very interesting dynamic between those two, because one of them is the adopted kid and one of them is the biological kid.
Listen, don't give DC any ideas, because right now I think we got enough kids flying around. We got John, we got Connor, and I'm glad he's back in the mix. We got the 2 kids that they adopted from Warworld. I think they're really having their cake and eating it too. And yeah, I mean, maybe what's going on in the books now is sort of an acknowledgement of exactly what we're talking about, that there's value in these different kinds of familial bonds, and especially the adoption angle. So yeah, I mean, I think Duncan's point is a great one. And I truly do wish we had gotten to see this play out a lot longer, even if Chris Kent ultimately went away, but if we could have seen this play out a bit longer, because it's the adoption angle, the fact that he's the son of Superman's enemies. I mean, there's really, that's very compelling. So yeah, I mean, I do feel like there was untapped potential there. And as far as what we do get, I mean, man, it's dark, because when we have Clark in the Phantom Zone reconnecting with Mon-El, I mean, Mon-El talks about how Zod and Ursa have been abusing their son for years. So it's very dark. You know, it's more, you know, in terms of, you know, those references. But then deeper into the story, we have Zod prepared to kill Chris Kent,
Yeah.
Zod, to demonstrate how far he's willing to go.
No, yeah, it was dark stuff, and you could definitely, and you know, I wonder, I'm not sure if you know why, but what the reason was for why they decided to just kind of like write Chris Kent out and never bring him back. Is it just kind of that? Was it just that thing in the air in the early 2000s of not wanting to tie characters down, which is why they undid the Spider marriage and stuff like that, and why they kind of teased the idea of undoing Superman and Lois as well at one point?
I mean, I don't know, because like I said, he does come back. It's been a while since I went through all the new Krypton stuff, but I mean, he comes back aged up and is Nightwing of Nightwing and Flamebird fame. But yeah, I mean, it's still not this dynamic of him as a little boy being, I mean, I don't know. I mean, here's the thing that's weird is that we've been talking about Superman Returns. Well, Superman Returns has young Jason. So
that's another thing too. I wondered at the time, like, did they do this because of Superman Returns introducing Jason?
Yeah. I mean, it is all a bit curious, but you know, the little bit of the dynamic we get, I like, and you know, you got to the climax of the story, and Chris Kent sacrifices himself to close that portal to the Phantom Zone to spare Clark. So, yeah, I mean, I think really compelling stuff. I mean, as far as the Zod piece of everything, you know, when Zod and Non and Ursa arrive, I mean, it's weird. I mean, going back and looking at it now, I mean, we've been kind of living now with the true versions of these characters, so to speak, in the comics for a while. But I mean, like, this was a big deal at the time to actually have them. And obviously was very much in the vein of the movies, but this is where, and I very much like the art of Gary Frank, but I'm so happy it was Adam Kubert doing the art here, because at least, even though when Zod speaks, you can hear the late, great, recently departed Terrence Stamp, and that's not a bad thing, but at least it wasn't like they were shoving it in your face either. I felt like it was able to be its own thing, even while homaging the movie. I mean, how did you feel?
No, I definitely agree with that. I mean, the only criticism I have of Kubert's art in this is I don't like the goggles they wore. But other than that, I thought they were great. I thought his designs were very evocative of Superman 2 without being slavish to them in the way that Gary Frank's art is very slavish to Christopher Reeve. So yeah, and just like my God, there's so many double page spreads in this, and I'm glad that even with the delays, I'm glad they stuck with Kubert throughout, because apparently he had some medical issues during this, which was the cause of the delays, because his art is just freaking gorgeous in this. Like, it's just, you know, the panel layouts, the spreads, the images in this run completely move off the page. It's amazing.
I'm glad you brought up the double page spreads and the splash pages. There's a lot of that. It definitely has, and I wonder to what extent that's the Donner influence, because the word cinematic came to mind. Like, it really has that widescreen action-packed feel to it. I mean, why one of the splash pages that stands out, I think it's towards the end after the battle is done and it's Superman standing on a truck that's crashed into one of the top floors of a building, and this huge splash page, and you see the little Superman on the truck in the build, and it really gives you this wide scope of the proceedings, and it's really cool. My only kind of quibble with it is I feel like these were really brisk reads, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just, but yes, that is sort of the feel of this. Very action packed and fast paced, and the kind of that widescreen action, and the art certainly delivered on it. What I like too is, this is real quick, but I don't want to forget it. When we get to the point where Superman returns from the Phantom Zone, and basically for anyone who's needs a little refresher on the plot points of this, when Superman enters the Phantom Zone and he reconnects with Mon-El, what he learns is that when one of the prisoners was going to be sent to the Phantom Zone, there was a riot at the prison, Fort Roz, and the Phantom Zone projector exploded. And so the physical prison, Fort Roz, ended up in the zone. And basically, when anyone enters the prison in the zone, they attain corporeal form. That's how Zod and Ursa were able to have a baby and create the ship that ultimately sent their son to Earth and then created this tether to bring the rest of them there. And all of that. But when Superman returns, thanks to the help of Mon-El, he is forced to align himself with none other than Lex himself, who has spent years developing all of these weapons. So it's Superman teaming up with the Superman Revenge Squad, which includes Parasite and Metallo and Bizarro. And this is the part I didn't want to forget, when Non and Bizarro are battling. It's just a series of grunts back and forth. That really tickled me.
No, that was a fun moment. Also, when just Metallo's experimenting on the Kryptonian villains with all the different kryptonite he has. He's like, well, let's see what this one does. The red kryptonite transforms him into like a bug-like creature. And he just stomps on them. The gold kryptonite takes their powers away. Just you see like splat, 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 splat.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Another pre-crisis element. We spent a lot of time talking about the different shades of kryptonite, but having that back, although again, that's the funny thing. The few years leading up to Infinite Crisis, we already had an infusion of a lot of these elements. Following that kryptonite asteroid that landed during Superman Batman, you had Lex with the different shades of kryptonite. So it wasn't like this was coming back out of nowhere, but this still felt like a kind of a firmer reintroduction.
Mm-hmm. Well, also too, just that note too about the splat pages, just him and Parasite at the same time after they see that happening, just both saying "sweet."
Yeah. Yeah.
I got a kick. Oh, also Lex too, killing his first Kryptonian. He's like, so this is what it feels like.
Yeah. No, it was. Oh, and this is what I was getting to. So I think a little bit of this is blurring together. I think part of it comes in terms of the Kryptonian history that were shown in Last Son. At least some of this comes from one of the short stories that JOHNS and Donner did in Action Comics Annual 10. So I might be conflating a little bit of this, but the backstory between Zod and Non and Jor-El, the fact that Zod was a believer. Zod believed what Jor-El was preaching about the impending demise of the planet. Obviously, his approach was vastly different, killing members of the Science Council. But I really like that idea of them being aligned in their acceptance of Krypton's fate, but just really differing in how they approach it. But then beyond that, I thought really the really great touch was this added layer with Non, that Non had been the scientific mentor to Jor-El. They were friends, and the council ends up lobotomizing him. And that's how he ends up as the Non that we know from the movie. And then that we see here. I thought it was a very fascinating touch.
Yeah, that wasn't in the collection I read, but I did have a memory of that, and I had read it as just like a recap, and it refreshed my memory of it. And yeah, I thought that was a really cool touch as well, and it adds this other dimension to Non, who otherwise is almost kind of like gorilla-like in most of these appearances, like not only size, but even when they go to the fortress, he's like crouched on the ledge above them, type of thing. But I did want to mention the fact about when they do go to the fortress, because this is something that bugged me in the Donner cut of Superman 2, and it bugged me here too. This idea that you have this sophisticated AI system, but it treats everybody like it's Kal-El. And I'm like, I mean, come on. I mean, it you know, you need Kryptonian DNA to access the system, so you'd think it could be a little bit more specific than that. I mean, I get that you think he's the only one left, but I don't know. That feels like a big security flaw.
I agree with you. I mean, especially when it comes to Lex, because I'm slightly more forgiving if it's Zod and the idea is, okay, he's Kryptonian and the program is only expecting one Kryptonian, so it's not discriminating amongst Kryptonians. It's like, okay. But yeah, when it's Lex in the movies, it's like, come on. But even here, even with the other Kryptonians, if the program is sophisticated enough to interact and answer questions. I mean, in the next story, we'll have Superman go back there again and ask about tracking down Bizarro to a planet under a blue sun, and Jor-El will direct him. It's like, if the program can interact that much, it should be able to know who it's. I agree with you.
Yeah, that was just something that definitely stood out to me. Um, yeah, otherwise, it's a fun arc. It definitely ends on this, this bittersweet note at the end too, with Chris sacrificing himself to make sure that Clark can stay out of the Phantom Zone. We get those great moments with the villains, and yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in here. It really is just that the Daily Planet stuff, and just like again, if this was completely set outside of continuity, I think I would have no problem with it. But and I try not to be too much of a stickler for continuity, but when the stuff that what I feel is pretty egregious, especially from one arc to another, it's hard to discount.
Yeah, no, I do think that's fair. But no, yeah, like this was a lot of fun. It's going back to what I said at the top. Seeing a story like this, it just kind of reaffirms what I've always sort of wrestled with my beloved post-crisis era, where yeah, we had Pocket Universe Zod, and we had the Pocolistan Zod, and we had the Return to Krypton Brainiac program Zod, and we had the For Tomorrow Zod. But it's like, there's something to be said for just giving us full on Zod, who's from the one true Krypton and had this falling out with Jor-El and was in prison and swears vengeance on Jor-El and his son. Like, there's something to be said for that. So yeah, it's fun.
It took a few decades, but they finally decided, well, why don't we just give him Zod?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last arc that we'll talk about in part one of our coverage here is the three-parter Escape from Bizarro World, once again co-written by JOHNS and Donner, with art by Eric Powell. Now, I've never read The Goon, have you? Or any of his other work?
No. No, this is my first and only introduction to him, as far as I know.
Yeah, the art's amazing. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, but I mean, it's so striking and so fitting for a Bizarro-centric story that largely takes place on Bizarro World.
I think that's the key. Like, if you had like Eric Powell doing the art on like Last Sun, I don't think it would have worked. But I think doing it on Escape from Bizarro World, where pretty much all of it is set on Bizarro World, his art looks really good. And these covers are amazing, right? There's like very horror vibes at them, especially this one of all the Bizarros like charging at the reader. Really excellent work on this.
Yeah, so with this one, we have Bizarro abducting Jonathan Kent and bringing him to the cube-shaped Bizarro world, where all of his Bizarro creations have turned on him. And Bizarro wants Jonathan Kent's help in destroying Bizarro World. And so, of course, Superman takes off after him, and the story unfolds from there. The art is so striking, so fitting for this particular story. This is the last arc that Richard Donner co-writes with Geoff Johns before Johns will continue along solo. I mean, as far as connective tissue, we do have relatively early on, like I was mentioning before, Clark venturing to the fortress and speaking with AI Jor-El to obtain directions on, on tracking down Bizarro. It's... Despite enjoying the Kal-El Jor-El scenes in the Donner films, and despite how much I clearly got out of Clark versus AI Jor-El on Smallville, at the same time, especially once Superman is fully formed and established in his career, I don't know how much I really need him to be communing with this computer program.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was actually a question I wanted to ask you, was how, because I know you've had, a bit of a journey with the Donner films in general too. And also especially when we've had this, so much history in the post-crisis realm of Superman not having access to Jor-El. So, what did you feel about him coming to Jor-El so often for counsel in these two arcs? Because it feels like it's the way that Johns and Donner set it up. It's established like it's a regular recurring thing here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess overall, like I said, I mean, it's not my instinct, and but I think I can sort of reconcile it with the instances in other media that I like about it, because I feel like with certainly with Superman the movie, but even with Superman 2, where he's really faced with this choice about whether or not to remain as Superman. I guess I'm referring specifically to the Donner cut, where it's Jor-El he's talking to as opposed to Lara, but same idea either way. Um, where it's still at a relatively early formative stage in his journey, and then certainly on Smallville, where it's all about him building up to that point of becoming Superman. I guess I'm more open to it when Superman is not yet fully formed and he's having these interactions as he's sort of finding his way, because those are the contexts where I guess it works most for me. But in these stories where he's fully formed, fully established, well into his career as Superman, I guess, yeah, I guess it doesn't add much for me, and in a way arguably undermines the tragedy of the loss of Krypton if he's still able to have these conversations. And that it's beyond just, oh, he's watching a recording, but he's actually interacting. I think that's kind of where I land.
So you know what I think is a missed opportunity here is the fact that they establish in Last Son that he had access to this technology all this time, he just hasn't used it in a long time. Whereas I think what would have been much more interesting is if, which is what I thought going into it, was this is the first time he's been able to commune with Jor-El. And I think that would have created an interesting dynamic because, I mean, imagine that, right? You go your whole life never knowing your father. And then as an adult, now you're married and all this, and you have the chance to speak to him face to face. I mean, that's a pretty powerful thing. And it's just completely not used at all here. And I think that would have been a much more interesting much more interesting direction. Because, my father's been gone for like um 5 or so years now. And I mean, even now, with all the changes in my life have happened since then. I got married. I had two kids. Like that's a lot that's happened in the time since he's been gone. So, I mean, just being able to speak to him at just about the past few years. But imagine Clark. Now he's like what 30 something, and being able to speak to his father for the first time. I think that would be a very interesting dynamic. I wish they had taken that track with it because then I would understand why he's constantly going back to the fortress and talk and communing with Jor-El.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think if you're going to do it, it needs to serve a very specific character story function. And what we get across Last Son and Escape from Bizarro World, really just a few conversations between Clark and Jor-El. And a lot of it, especially in Last Son, I think at the beginning and the end, it basically conveys the same idea. Even though you look like one of them, you are not one of them. Echoing the verbiage from the films. And I guess that'll pay off later when we get to the Legion arc and Superman has that whole moment about, Earthman saying, you don't know what it's like to be rejected and be an outsider. And Superman's like, I've been an outsider every day of my life. So thematically, I guess it all ties together. But yeah, I mean, if you're gonna incorporate this device, I think maybe have it really count. And I just don't know that it especially in an instance like this, where he's really just asking for directions. I feel like this could have been Helix, or this, he could have gone to the Justice League. Whereas maybe there could have been more to mine in the sense that he's asking the artificial recreation of his biological father for help in tracking down his adoptive father. Maybe that could have been more of an angle to really mine.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that's what I expected going into this. I mean, you're going to your biological father to say like, "Hey, the father who raised me, who I consider my real father, he's gone. I need your help to find him now." I mean, even though it's an AI, I mean, like it's presumably, well, I don't know because we saw the whole thing with Zod being able to access it, so maybe not. But it's presumably got Jor-El's emotions as well. So you'd imagine that if it was a real AI, it would have some sort of emotional connection or some sort of emotional reaction or something. But it's just pure exposition is what he's used for here, and it's a very much a missed opportunity, I felt.
Nah, I hear you. As far as the Bizarro side of it, by the way, I feel like unless Infinite Crisis rewrote Bizarro, the Bizarro we're with here is still the Bizarro who was created during Emperor Joker and got shuttled back to our reality. Because in the post-crisis landscape, we had the initial clone that Lex created during Man of Steel. Then early Triangle era, we had Lex creating another one during that Bizarro's World storyline around the time of Fall of Metropolis. That period of time. And then we had this Bizarro created during Emperor Joker. And again, unless Infinite Crisis undid any of that, I think that's still ostensibly the Joker, the Bizarro we're working with. But
I mean, because didn't he mention either in one of these arcs? I think it was in Last Son, or maybe it was this one, that he mentioned that Lex Luthor can control Bizarro because he created him. Was that mentioned? Am I
that he
misremembering?
created him? I mean, I know Lex was training Bizarro in
maybe
Last
I'm
Son,
just
so
misremembering
I
it.
think that was it. But I'm just still always hung up on Emperor Joker. I love it. But so here, we find out that Bizarro has fused these asteroids together and created this cubed planet, and that under a blue sun, this is what Jor-El explains, under a blue sun, Bizarro can develop new abilities just like Superman can. And specifically for Bizarro, it's this Bizarro vision where he uses it on his own organic matter, and then it creates these other Bizarro beings. So we have a whole world populated with Bizarro. So another instance of a relic of the pre-crisis era, dusted off and brought back here. I think to good effect. I enjoyed this story. And the fact that it was centered around Superman's adoptive father being taken, I thought it was compelling. What did you think of the fact that, by and large, we did not have Bizarro speak, backward Bizarro speak?
I was a fan of it. I mean, the first time I saw this story, it was, one of the trades on sale on Amazon. And I'm just like, I was looking at the price and it was on one of those big DC sales. I'm just like, Bizarro. Do I want to buy a trade that is a story that is just focused on Bizarro? But I did anyway. And I enjoyed it the first time I read it. And I enjoyed it too this time around as well. Because I thought that, first off, God bless Johns for not leaning in too hard on the Bizarro speak here, because it makes my head hurt almost every time I read it here. But it wasn't so bad here, and also too, just the way that he had found a way to create the Bizarro world in a way that actually made sense in comic book sciencey terms, but it worked, right? This is how Bizarro comes from a cube planet. He smashes these two asteroids together. How do we have a whole race of Bizarro people? Well, it's a blue sun. It gives him strange powers, and he's able to duplicate himself. Comic book logic, it works, right? It's just that enough of an explanation that it works, and I was fine with that. But also too, it's very nice that we got this story, and I'm because there's a Last Son omnibus or like deluxe trade or something, and it includes Last Son and it includes Brainiac, and it does not include this story, which I think is a mistake, because given what happens in Brainiac when Jonathan Kent dies, I think this story is really crucial to, establishing that relationship between Clark and Jonathan before he eventually takes his final bow.
So these stories have been collected in a number of different ways, none totally satisfactory to me, but there is, because I read on the app, there is a Last Son deluxe edition that includes Last Son and Escape from Bizarro World. So it collects basically the two Richard Donner co-written arcs. There's also a different collection that collects Last Son and Brainiac.
That's one I have.
But there's not one that collects all of them. And I agree with you. I mean, I feel like this, as much as it's a Bizarro romp, it is, I think, important setup for the Jonathan's passing later. We get a couple of, I think, poignant flashbacks to young Clark as he's discovering his powers and talking to Jonathan, and his telescopic vision has kicked in and he sees the other kids playing, but Jonathan doesn't want him to play. And And then Jonathan starts asking him about his powers. And, this pays off at the end where Clark thanks Jonathan for making sure that he never felt alone during those difficult times.
I'm glad you singled out that page about the football scene, because I literally have that one queued up here to talk about, because it's just Jonathan's trying to reassure him, and he's like, there's more to life than football, and just Clark's line here kills me, right? It's not about football, right? It's just he wants to be part of it, and again, Powell's art here is amazing. Like, it's not like super detailed or anything, but just like the way he draws this single panel of Jonathan, just with the dark eyes and everything, and his face like half in shadow, it totally conveys what Jonathan's feeling in that moment. And then segues right away, like you said, him asking him, "What can you see here?" And him asking him about his powers and trying to find a way to connect with him. It's beautiful. Like, I'm almost tearing up thinking about this.
Yeah, and going back to the question I posed earlier, yeah, I did not mind the lack of backward speak, even though I have largely come to terms and made my peace with it. But here it's just really just kind of that limited Bizarro speech pattern of me, I'm Bizarro, as opposed to everything having the opposite meaning of what he says. So that was refreshing, although they do dip into it occasionally. When Superman asks Bizarro, "Where's my father?" Bizarro says he's dead. And Superman goes, "Oh, but that means he isn't," right? So there are times where they do slip into a little bit of it, but for the most part, we don't have to translate much, which is welcome. And I feel like more than anything, you get backward logic, which I much prefer. This whole idea that the criminals on Bizarro World are imprisoned, their punishment is to live at the amusement park and have to ride the rides and eat cotton candy. Like, that's great. Give me that over the backward speak all day.
Yeah, that's so much more preferable, and it's a much better illustration of the backwards nature of Bizarro. Including like the Bizarro Justice League, right? You've got Batman with the smiley face on his chest. You've got Flash being overweight and eating hot dogs. You've got a Yellow Lantern instead.
Yeah, who gets drafted into the Sinestro Corps.
Yeah.
So you got that going on. Yeah, but you get the Justice League, you get the Metropolis supporting cast, Lex, Doomsday Bizarro as well. So it's fun. What exactly was your read, though, on why the Bizarros turned on Bizarro #1? Because there's talk early on. I think it's Lois specifically who's like, "I write about crimes, and you stop crimes, you stop disasters." It seemed like that was what people were upset about, like his heroic efforts, maybe. I don't know. Like, what was your read on exactly why? I mean, maybe there's no logic to be had there, but I was just curious.
I mean, I honestly, I just assumed there was no logic to be had, and I just didn't really pay much attention to it, because I was just kind of going. I was just kind of like going with it, I was just kind of vibing with the whole thing, and just rolling with just how bizarre everything was in this world.
Yeah. I don't have a firm answer per se, but I do like how they ultimately wrap this up, where Clark and Jonathan are able to get through to Bizarro enough to hatch this plan where Superman's going to start fixing Bizarro World and cleaning it up and making it look beautiful, which of course is perceived as an affront to the Bizarro people and world. And so Bizarro will intervene and fight him off, and that will again, get everyone back on Bizarro's side. And, they're able to convince Bizarro this is a game. But Superman's like, I hope he understands like what we were really doing there.
What I just loved how, when Clark inadvertently gives Jonathan superpowers and he goes up against the Bizarro Doomsday and says, "This is for killing my boy in the first place."
Yes. No, I know. Yeah. So just as Bizarro has Bizarro vision that creates all these other Bizarros, Superman under the blue sun develops Superman vision, and to save his father is able to give Jonathan powers. Shades of Smallville there, though, very different circumstances. But it's cool, yeah, to see how much Jonathan enjoys them. And then they're gone by the time Jonathan and Clark get back to Earth. But you see him trying to lift the tractor to show Martha. He's like, "No, I could do it." And this was sweet when Bizarro makes the costume for Jonathan, right? Because I think that's when Jonathan says, "Yeah, I think he did understand what we were doing. Look what he made." Yeah, that was a nice touch.
Mm-hmm. And he's wearing the costume still when he goes back.
Yeah. No, this was a fun. I mean, I feel like this, not unlike Up and Away. I feel like when people talk about or write about the JOHNS stories, I do feel like Last Son, Legion, Brainiac, those tend to get the lion's share of the attention. But this 3-part Escape from Bizarro World it's a fun little 3-parter with really gorgeous art. You get a nice spotlight on Clark's relationship with Jonathan. Oh, this was the last other big thing I had about this was it was interesting to me how, in terms of like what Jonathan's sort of about in this story, a lot of it is convincing Clark to help the Bizarro people. Like Clark seems pretty quick to want to get Jonathan and leave, and even has a line at one point. It's like, I don't even know if they're alive, these things.
Mm-hmm.
But Jonathan is really the one who says, like, no, we have to help them. What'd you make of that?
Exactly. He says that, this is one, this might be the page you're talking about. Where he says, we have to help them all. How? This square world is one big madhouse, Dad. It's not their fault they're different, is it? They're more than different. Some would say that about you too, right? Perfect Jonathan Clark moment there, right? Him, calling Clark to task on stuff. And yeah, I loved it. I'm glad that, and it just goes to show just how much of Superman's values come from Jonathan and Martha and just the way he was raised. It's that idea is like, look, if you can help someone, you help them, right? That's just all there is to it. And it's just simple as that. Yeah, I love that. I love that part of it. Also just on the art too, I'm noticing now as I'm looking through this, just another reason why I think Eric Powell is a good choice, not only the way he draws the Bizarros, but also in contrast how he draws Superman, because it's almost like a stereotypical version of Superman, if you know what I mean, right? Very like square lantern jaw type, very, hands on the hips and type of thing, which is the cover of the trade paperback. And even like the dark eyes, it's very reminiscent of like the Flesher serials. And I think it's a very interesting look to use for this when you're doing it you're putting this character in this story against these, deformed creatures. And especially with Clark wondering, I don't know if I should help them and all that. It draws a nice little contrast, not only between the Bizarros, but also with our expectation of what we have of Superman. So I think that's another really cool aspect of choosing him to do the art for this.
Yeah, right on. This is another one. Again, if people haven't read it, do check it out. It was a lot of fun. I mean, pretty much all these other stories that we're talking about, I've gone back to over the past few years, but not Escape from Bizarro World. So I was really happy to be able to revisit that one. All right. So in this part one here, we talked about a lot of big picture ideas, topics, questions as they pertain to the Geoff Johns time on Action Comics. And then we got more specific with Up and Away, Last Son, and Escape from Bizarro World. Next week in part two, like I said, we'll get into that Toyman issue with its important retcon. And then Johns' collaborations with Gary Frank. So Superman and the Legion, Brainiac, and Secret Origin. So Perry, thank you very much for joining me for part one. I look forward to recording part two with you. Audience, I appreciate you guys tuning in. And Perry, we mentioned your podcast, Superhero Cinephiles, at the top. What would you like to mention to folks on that front?
So if you are also a fan of urban fantasy for any reason, I have just completed a trilogy called Chaos Caretakers. Monster Sitter is the first book, then Monster Trainer, and then Monster Mentor is the third book, which just came out. So definitely check those out. You can go to percivalconstantine.com to check those out. Also, if you go to percivalconstantine.com/SCP, you can get some free superhero books and stories that I have out as well. You just have to enter in your email address and you get access to those for free. So definitely check those out. And again, superherocinephiles.com if you're interested in superhero movies. And coming up soon, we're going to start having comic book coverage as well.
All right, awesome. Well, I hope everyone checks that out. Make sure you come back next week for part two. And until then, as always, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. By popular demand, Digging for Kryptonite merch is now available at our TeePublic store. Visit the link in the show notes to get your DFK shirts, hats, mugs, and more. Support the show and receive exclusive content, including the spin-off podcast Beyond Metropolis, by becoming a member at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. My sincere thanks to all patrons. Please subscribe, rate, and review today via your platform of choice, and continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Flat Squirrel Podcast is also home to another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman, now covering the color era of the classic George Reeves series. Subscribe today. Digging for Kryptonite is a Flat Squirrel production. Key art by Isaiah Simmons and theme music by Dan Pritchard.